Hello, welcome to our series of weekly devotionals. We're moving right along through our look at some verses in chapter 17 of the book of the prophet Ezekiel, dealing with some trouble and suffering and heartache and grief that the people of Judah are experiencing at the hands of the Babylonians. And speaking of grief, in all the funerals that I've officiated at and attended in my time in ministry, I've learned, probably pretty early on, that as a pastor, there's nothing you can really say during a funeral service that's going to make people feel better. There are no words that can take away pain and grief. But that doesn't stop people from trying. I always get sort of annoyed when people say things like, say things about the deceased person. Well, God just needed another angel for his choir, or some such nonsense. And I've reflected often that these kinds of statements are not given to help the grieving person with their grief. They're offered to help the person who says them deal with their discomfort. Because, let's face it, most people don't like sitting in grief and having to endure those difficult moments of grief and loss and sadness. But Ezekiel, before he offers his words of comfort to the people of Judah, he spends a lot of time dwelling on the grief. He gives full weight and consideration to lamenting, to considering the grief and trauma that the people of Judah are going through. And I think this is important and necessary for people to do this, to be able to process these things instead of just trying to move on to words of comfort and hope. I know that when I went through the chaplaincy training that I did at St. Luke's Hospital, we were advised not to try to make people feel better, but to simply, as best we could, to remind people through our presence that God was present with them, sitting with them during their struggles, and we were to sit with them and to hold space for the sacred presence of God in the midst of their grief and struggles. And we're reminded that these words of hope, Ezekiel's words of hope, do not exist outside of the trouble and heartache, but indeed exist in the midst of them. And I think that we are reminded also that as Christians, we are Easter people, and the central act, the focal point of our faith is indeed the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which reminds us that the hope of God is not about avoiding trouble, but about a love that transforms it. Amen.